The entire hall suddenly fell silent as Richard Anderson, the CEO of Hale Technologies, let out a cold laugh. "Security, please escort her out. This is not a charity event," he said, his gaze dripping with contempt. Everyone turned to look, their eyes fixed on the woman standing in the middle of the crowd. That woman was Emily Carter, and she did not move, standing there calmly in the face of the humiliation. No one dared to speak up. No one dared to object. The atmosphere was thick, as if time itself had come to a halt. The wine glasses in the hands of the affluent guests trembled slightly, the faint vibration of the glass signaling a tension that couldn't be put into words. Everything slowed down, but the shame Emily felt in that moment felt like a punch to her heart, a deep wound to her soul. As a woman of color, she had spent her entire life fighting to earn her place in this world. The judging glances, the sarcastic words she had endured now came crashing down on her like a tidal wave tearing apart everything she had built. But what made Emily stronger than ever was her ability to control her emotions. She didn't need to shout. She knew in just a moment everything would change. Richard, completely unmoved, continued his judgment. "You have no right to be here. People like you don't belong in this world." His voice rang out like a sharp cut, as though his words weren't just tearing through the air, but stabbing straight into Emily's heart. But she stood there unmoving, not trembling, not showing any sign of weakness. Emily locked eyes with Richard, her heart unafraid. She was used to the insults, used to the looks of disdain. But this time, unlike the others, she wasn't going to let it slide quietly. She was ready to face it. She knew that what Richard was doing was the biggest insult, not just to her, but to everyone who had been looked down upon simply because they were different. But this was just the beginning. When Richard ordered security to escort her out, all the curious eyes followed, and not a single one dared to intervene. They were bystanders, never having to face the humiliation she was enduring. They only saw a woman of color, dressed simply, standing amidst the opulence of a high society gala. They didn't know that the very woman they were looking down on was the owner of everything around them. No one had ever dared mock her like Richard had, and they didn't know that right now Emily stood on her own land. This building, this company, all the multi-million-dollar contracts, they all belonged to her. Richard had no idea that with his command, he had already set in motion an inevitable change. The security guard stepped forward, 2 men in black uniforms moving toward her. They didn't understand the truth, but Emily didn't need to explain. She stood up slowly, the carved wooden chair creaking under her touch. She wasn't rushing, wasn't panicking. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. Emily moving slowly, each step deliberate, as though she was walking into a battle she was certain she would win. And just as she had thought in that moment as she walked toward the door, a cold, authoritative voice rang out from the far side of the room, shattering the silence like a storm. "We won't allow you to shame us any longer," Richard said, but the confidence in his tone began to waver. He didn't know that his words would be the end of his empire. She walked outside, but her heart was not troubled. She knew that everything had started to change in that very moment, and as the doors closed behind her, she didn't look back. She had long been accustomed to small failures in life, but today this was not a failure. It was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. Emily didn't need to shout. She didn't need to rush in to explain. She simply needed to stand firm and let the truth speak for itself. Those around her had no idea that right then and there, Emily was the one holding the greatest power. The scene of the lavish gala had now been completely transformed. People stood frozen, their eyes still fixed on Emily as she walked out of the room. The sound of wine, glasses clinking, the whispers of the guests, all became an unfamiliar noise, like waves crashing on the shore. Everything seemed to slow down, but for Emily, everything was clear. As she stepped out of the grand hall, Emily didn't rush, didn't flee. She walked calmly like someone who had nothing to fear. No one blocked her way, because in their eyes, she was just a woman of color, not fitting the atmosphere of this luxurious party. But she knew she was the one who had created that very atmosphere. She was the one who had built an empire, and now that empire was about to be restored to its rightful place. As Emily neared the door, a cold voice rang out from behind her, cutting through the air like a knife. You cannot allow your actions to disrupt this event any further. Richard, the one who had started all of this, couldn't stop fueling the fire. But this time, his tone was no longer sharp and full of confidence as before. There was a quiver in his voice, confusion beginning to show. Emily paused for a moment, not turning around, but she heard clearly every word Richard spoke. She knew this time he wasn't just an executive, but a man who feared losing everything. The room now no longer held the looks of disdain and contempt. Every eye was now on Richard, as if he had been exposed in the very room he had thought he controlled. As Emily stepped outside, she didn't hurry. She knew that this battle wasn't about an instant victory, but a long process of proving her true strength. She stood there quietly, with no hint of emotional turmoil. She had faced so many challenges, endured so many insults countless times, having to prove herself in a world that never accepted someone like her. But now she was ready to change everything. As Emily left the event, Richard still stood there, unsure of what he had just done. He had called security, had driven her out, but all he had achieved was confusion and the impending collapse. Richard didn't understand that in that moment he was no longer the powerful one in that room. He was the weak one, exposed for his helplessness, before a woman who was not only capable but also possessed dignity and power beyond his reach. As Emily left the event, she no longer felt hurt. It had been too long since she allowed herself to be broken by the words or actions of others. She understood that in this world, respect doesn't always come from those in power, but from those who can stand firm in the storm without losing themselves. And Emily had just proven that. What mattered was not Richard's degrading words or the indifferent looks from those around her. What mattered was that Emily knew exactly who she was. She no longer needed to prove herself to anyone. She had everything she needed to stand strong in a world full of challenges and prejudices. Meanwhile, inside the hall, Richard still couldn't understand what was happening. He didn't know that he had just made a serious mistake. The mistake wasn't in driving Emily away, it was in failing to recognize who she really was. She was not an unknown woman, but the one who owned everything he was building. She was the one who could decide the fate of his empire. And Richard had failed to understand that now he would have to pay for his contempt. Less than a minute after Emily left, the murmurs began in the room. The people around started realizing that they had just witnessed a historic moment. A moment when true power was revealed. Everything before them now seemed like a power game, where the strong were not those with money, but those with dignity. And Emily, with her composure, had shown everyone that true power doesn't need to scream, doesn't need to boast, but simply requires someone who knows how to stand firm and let the truth speak for itself. The story had begun to change, and Richard, who had once been on top of it all, now only had confusion, left the realization that his power could not last without respect and integrity. Emily had made him realize one simple yet powerful truth: real power cannot be bought with money. It must be built on dignity and respect for others. And Emily, the woman he had just humiliated, was the one who would change everything. As Emily walked out of the hall, the tension and anxiety began to fade within her. But inside, she knew that everything had only just begun. She couldn't have imagined that the very moment of humiliation would open up an opportunity to change not only her own life, but also the system she was part of. Everything had changed now. The people in the crowd, the ones standing on the sidelines, had witnessed a struggle that wasn't just Emily's, but the fight of everyone who had ever been overlooked or disrespected. As she stepped outside, Emily's slow footsteps echoed on the marble floor, as if she were walking into a battle she had been preparing for all her life. She had nothing to rush for, and no need to say anything more. She understood that right now, her actions would speak for themselves. No one could take away her confidence or belief in herself, no matter how hard they tried. Meanwhile, in the meeting room of Hale Technologies, Richard Anderson began to sense a change in the atmosphere. The whole space became so silent, it was almost uncomfortable. Eyes were fixed on him, no longer with admiration or respect, but with hesitation and doubt. Surely no one in that room would want to be in Richard's position right now. He tried to maintain his calm demeanor, but the truth was, everything had changed too quickly. The very system he had built was slowly crumbling, and it all started with his arrogant words towards Emily. His actions hadn't just hurt her. They had shattered every value he had spent years constructing. Meanwhile, Emily didn't stop. She stood still for a moment, feeling the gazes behind her, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to confront Richard right now. All she needed was one right decision, and she had enough power to change everything. She knew that at this moment it wasn't her who needed to prove herself, but those who had tried to put her down. They would now face the consequences of their contempt and disrespect. As Emily got into the car waiting outside, she no longer felt anger, only a strange sense of peace. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to make the world know she had been treated unfairly. She had done it with her silence, with actions that only those who truly understood could recognize. Meanwhile, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. He couldn't understand how Emily had managed to stay so calm, or why his words hadn't brought her down. Truly, he couldn't predict that the moment he pushed her out of the event she had a plan no one could have expected. The entire room now felt like a pile of rubble. The wine glasses on the table no longer made cheerful sounds, only a disturbing silence remained. The suffocating feeling came not just from the quiet, but from the unease Richard was now facing. He looked out the window where the tall buildings reflected the neon lights, but there was no longer the stability he once felt when standing in this position. Just then his phone rang. It was a call from the company's CFO. He pressed the button to answer, trying to keep his face emotionless, but in the voice of the caller, Richard recognized something he had never considered. Richard, the CFO's voice, came through filled with worry. "Something's wrong. Major contracts are being held up, and our bank accounts are being frozen. I don't know what's happening, but we might be facing big trouble." The reality of it hit Richard like being thrown off the peak he had once stood on. Every word, every action he had taken in the past few moments now felt like the cause of his empire beginning to fall into danger. Richard, could it be her? Is she the one who did this? The CFO asked, his voice trembling. Richard didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to admit that he had just created an opportunity for Emily. He didn't want to accept that his arrogance had pushed everything to the brink of collapse. He could clearly feel that he had been too complacent and hadn't paid attention to those around him. Outside, Emily sat in the car looking through the window as the vehicle started moving toward her company. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to race against time anymore. She knew that with just one more call, everything would be resolved. And she understood that this was the moment when true power would reveal itself. The tension in Emily's heart seemed to dissipate as the car entered her company's premises. Everything felt calm, but inside a storm was quietly brewing. Richard's words and actions still echoed in her mind. She had endured so much, but all she had done was remain silent and stand firm. This was the moment when she couldn't just pass by without leaving a mark. She stepped out of the car holding her small leather bag, her head held high, as if nothing could shake her confidence. The employees noticed her. Some turned away. Others looked at her with respect. No one knew. No one understood. But Emily didn't need to explain. She knew who she was, and she knew what she could do. As she walked into the building, the employees were still busy with their work, unaware that she had returned after an event that had shaken the business world. But today she wasn't here to work as usual. Today she was here to change everything. When she entered her office, Emily simply sat down and stared at the computer screen where a pile of financial reports and work plans were displayed. She didn't care about any of that right now. The numbers, the contracts worth millions of dollars no longer mattered. She had something bigger to do, something that could change the entire industry she was in. A call came from an unknown number. She didn't need to look at the name. Just hearing the voice on the other end was enough for her to recognize who was calling. "Emily," the voice of the CFO echoed. "We're in big trouble. The major contracts we were about to sign are on hold. Our bank accounts are frozen. Everything has collapsed after that event." Emily wasn't surprised. She had already anticipated this. Richard, who had humiliated her at the gala, couldn't maintain his upper hand when everything started to unravel. Emily felt a sense of satisfaction, but not because she wanted to see him fail. She simply knew that when people lack respect, everything falls apart. "What's next, Emily?" the CFO asked, his voice full of worry. "Do you have a plan?" "Don't worry," Emily replied calmly. "Everything will be fine. Just wait a little longer." She hung up the phone and turned to look at the plan board in her office. Her mind was filled with thoughts. Plans not about growing the company, but about making everyone realize that true power cannot be bought with money. It doesn't come from manipulation or contempt, but from respect. She picked up the phone and called her legal team. "I want you to prepare all the necessary documents to sue Richard Anderson and Hale Technologies. They will pay for what they've done today." Her words rang out with determination, without hesitation. Richard's actions were not just a personal insult, but a declaration of war against everyone who believed in justice, respect, and equality. She couldn't let him get away with this, not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew that silence and forgiveness would only create more pain for others. Meanwhile, in Richard's office, he was starting to realize the unavoidable change. No longer were there words of praise or admiration from his employees. but a heavy silence filled with anxiety. He called the CFO but only received reports filled with doubt and uncertainty. Important contracts were on hold, bank accounts were frozen, and it all stemmed from an event no one had anticipated. Richard, the CFO, said over the phone, his voice full of confusion. "We could lose everything if we don't resolve this." Richard didn't respond immediately. He stood up, pacing back and forth in his office, clutching a report about the incident at the event. He couldn't believe that such a small action could lead to such massive consequences. But he couldn't change anything now. Everything had spiraled out of control. "What do we do now?" the CFO asked, his voice lacking any confidence. "There's nothing left to do." Richard sighed, his voice resigned. "She's won." Emily wasn't someone who demanded change. She didn't need to do anything more. She had let the truth speak for itself. As for Richard, he couldn't accept that his own arrogance had cost him everything. As Emily left her office, she felt a strange sense of relief. She didn't need to do anything more because everything was already beginning to change on its own. And now, as her footsteps left the building, she knew that victory didn't come from revenge, but from resilience, from the ability to stay true to herself in the toughest of times. In the first moments after stepping out of the building, Emily felt a sense of calm settle within her. She no longer worried about what had happened. She no longer needed to care about the calls, the meetings, or the judgments of others. Everything had already been decided. The events were no longer changeable, and she had done what was necessary to make Richard Anderson's empire face its own downfall. She paused for a moment, still holding her leather bag, and looked into the distance. The faint clouds in the evening sky no longer made her feel pressure or gloom. All her life, Emily had endured contempt, the disrespect of those who judged her by her skin color and appearance. But this time, she had responded with action, not words. She had proven that real power doesn't lie in numbers or flashy things. True power lies in dignity, resilience, and the ability to stand firm amidst the storm without breaking. Her footsteps echoed down the empty street, the sound loud and clear like a declaration. She was no longer the woman others looked down on. She had proven that she could change this world, at least within the scope she controlled. Each step was strong, as though she was walking on her own path, one no one could block. She stopped in front of a small cafe, looked into the glass, and saw her reflection. A woman in simple business, attire nothing too flashy, but her eyes full of confidence and calm that no one could easily take away. That confidence she had fought for her entire life. At that moment, her phone buzzed. A message from the CFO of the company reporting on the financial situation. But Emily didn't open it right away. She had gotten used to these kinds of messages. She had heard enough. But this time, when she opened the message, she read each line with a calm authority. The major contracts were on hold, but there was nothing to worry about. She knew exactly what she needed to do. Everything was within her control. Emily, the CFO, said over the phone, his voice filled with concern. "We're in serious trouble. The contracts are stalled. Our accounts are frozen, and I don't know how to resolve this." "Don't worry," Emily replied calmly, her voice steady and certain. "I'll take care of it. Everything will be fine. I'll make the final decision." She hung up and turned to look at the plan board in her office. Her mind was full of thoughts, plans not about growing the company, but about making everyone realize that real power isn't something that can be bought with money. It doesn't come from manipulation or contempt, but from respect. She picked up the phone and called her leadership team. "Thank you for waiting. From now on, we're taking a new direction, Emily said, her voice firm and unwavering. "All current contracts will be suspended. I want all contracts with Hale Technologies cancelled. We'll start over." Those words were the final decision. No confusion, no hesitation. Emily knew she would never go back to the days of being looked down upon. She had stood firm, and now she would rebuild from the very foundation she had created. As she hung up, a strange sense of peace enveloped her. Everything had been resolved. She wasn't facing the collapse of the empire she had built, but an opportunity for it to become stronger, to never be forgotten. And it was she, the woman who had once been humiliated, who would change everything. "No one can humiliate me anymore," Emily whispered, her eyes shining with a determination that nothing could shake. "And I will prove that." Richard Anderson stood by the office window, his eyes gazing out over the bustling city below. The bright neon lights from the towering buildings reflected in his eyes, but his mind couldn't focus on that beauty. All he could hear in his head were the final words Emily had spoken. "Just stand firm. The truth will speak for itself." Richard couldn't bear the silence in the large room. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least from his point of view. He was merely protecting his power, protecting the empire he had worked so hard to build. But right now, he could feel the weight of failure steadily creeping in. He turned around and sat down at his desk, picking up the phone, trying to remain calm as he called the CFO. "Is there any news?" His voice was hoarse, unable to hide his confusion. The CFO, always quiet and cautious, responded immediately, "Richard, the situation is very serious. The major contracts have been suspended. Our accounts are frozen. We've lost everything. Hale Technologies, if we don't do something now, will collapse." The words hit Richard like a shock to his core. He let the phone fall from his hand shaking, cold sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He had never anticipated that just one moment of arrogance could lead to the downfall of the empire he had built. The truth hit him suddenly like a wave crashing against the shore. He looked around the office, once a symbol of power and success, now feeling like a prison. He could feel each passing hour growing heavier than ever before. As he recalled the confrontation with Emily, the truth became clearer. He had treated her as someone unworthy of attention, a person to be looked down upon with contempt. He didn't think that a woman of color could threaten his position. But today he understood that it was that very contempt that had led to the collapse of everything he had built. Richard stood up, walked to the window, and looked out again, where the city lights still shone brightly. Since entering this industry, he had always believed that money and power were everything. He had learned to manipulate, control everything, and never let anyone disrespect him. But now he realized he had been wrong. What he was losing could not be bought with money. It was respect, integrity, and above all, understanding true power. Meanwhile, Emily was no longer there to witness Richard's chaotic emotions. She knew she wasn't seeking revenge or humiliation. She was simply doing what needed to be done in her own way. She wasn't a person who wanted to win out of hatred. She won because she believed that real values would always outlast the temporary. When the call ended, the CFO, still full of confusion, couldn't say anything more. He didn't know what to do to salvage the situation. Richard's wrong decisions had now pushed the entire company to the brink. "She's won," the CFO said, his voice drained of hope. Richard didn't answer. He stood still, the room seeming to spin. He couldn't understand that he had allowed a woman, one he had never respected, to become the one who changed everything. The feeling of failure flooded him from his wounded pride to the fear for his future. But the scariest part was he couldn't go back. He had gone too far, pushed everything into this state. His arrogance had broken everything. In a moment, all that he believed in collapsed. Business relationships, expensive contracts, important partners, all of them now were wounds that bled uncontrollably. Outside, the employees were still working, unaware that in that moment a decision had been made. Emily had done her part. She had turned the tide and created a turning point. And those who had been humiliated, those who had been underestimated, were now beginning to see a new opportunity. Richard could do nothing now. He realized there was no way to escape the consequences of his arrogance. Everything had gone too far, and while he struggled to hold on to what he had, Emily was moving forward, not just as a winner, but as someone who would change an entire system. When Richard returned to his desk, the atmosphere in the room remained cold. He sighed deeply, feeling profoundly that no matter how hard he tried, this collapse was inevitable. In the days that followed, Richard could not shake the heavy feeling that clung to him. He had once believed that power and wealth could solve everything, that every difficulty in life could be overcome by controlling everything around him. But this time he was wrong. His arrogance hadn't just hurt one person. It had caused the collapse of an entire system he had built with so much effort. Every morning when Richard woke up, he felt like he was standing in front of an invisible wall. Calls from subordinates, reports from directors, all full of worry, could not change the situation. Major contracts were on hold. The company's bank accounts were frozen. What Richard had once been proud of was now nothing more than a pile of ruins that he couldn't fix. Every time he thought of Emily, the feeling of helplessness rose within him. How could a woman change everything in just one moment like that? She hadn't just won a personal battle. She had delivered a powerful lesson about true power, that arrogance, no matter how great, would eventually be exposed. In the office, the atmosphere was more tense than ever. Employees began to avoid looking Richard in the eye, as if they could feel the failure spreading in the room. Calls from major partners, those he had once faced with confidence, were now full of coldness and rejection. They no longer trusted him. They no longer saw a strong CEO, but a man struggling with his own arrogance. One morning, as Richard sat in his office, a call from the legal director startled him. The voice on the other end was full of worry. "Richard, I just received notification. Multi-million-dollar contracts with foreign partners have been cancelled. Major companies have pulled out of our projects. They don't want to be associated with us anymore." Richard remained silent, his hands clenched on the desk. He felt like he was being pulled into a whirlpool he couldn't escape. What else is there anyway to salvage this? His voice became hoarse from the tension. "We've done everything we can," the legal director replied. "There's only one option." Left face the legal consequences of the contract cancellations and potential lawsuits. I fear it's too late. When the call ended, Richard leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the computer screen. Each number on the financial report seemed to erode everything left within him. He had once thought that money and power could provide stability, but now all that remained was confusion and fear. In the following days, things only worsened. Employees in the company seemed to lose trust in Richard's leadership. They began to doubt, and some even left. Important meetings were no longer held. Business deals were indefinitely delayed. The feeling of losing control and anxiety kept growing as Richard could no longer rely on the strategies that had once helped him stay strong in the past. One afternoon, as Richard sat in his office, The dim light coming through the window, he realized something clearly. Everything he had once trusted, success, power, and status, had now become worthless. He was no longer the one standing at the top, but a man struggling to hold on to what little remained. His arrogance and ambition had cost him everything. Just then, an unfamiliar number flashed on his phone. Richard answered the call without looking at the name of the caller. "Richard, I need to meet with you immediately," the voice on the phone said coldly. "If we don't act now, we won't be able to save the company." Richard didn't recognize the caller, but the unease inside him immediately rose. It felt as if everything around him was slowly collapsing. "Where should we meet?" he asked, his voice full of worry. "At the cafe near your building." "I can't discuss details over the phone," the caller responded. Richard had no other choice. He knew that the situation couldn't continue like this. Even if he tried everything to solve it, he couldn't escape the truth that everything had been tangled up from his wrong decisions. He had hurt too many people, and now the consequences had arrived. When Richard arrived at the cafe, his face no longer held the confidence it once did. Everything had changed. He was no longer the one standing at the top. He was just a man racing against time to save what little remained. The evening breeze swept gently through the buildings, carrying the chill of autumn as Emily stepped out of the car. She had returned to the company, but this time not to handle her usual work. Her mind was filled with bigger plans, inevitable changes she was going to bring to her own company and the industry she was a part of. Everything had shifted the moment she stepped out of that gala, where everyone had witnessed the collapse of an empire Richard Anderson once took pride in. She walked down the company hallway, each step affirming the power she held. Emily didn't need to make a loud show of force. She knew that silence and steadfastness were the true forms of power. The feeling of victory wasn't joy, but a calm certainty that she was on the right path. She understood that when you've reached the top, what matters isn't the outward appearance, but the ability to stay grounded in your mind. When Emily entered her office, she paused for a moment before sitting down. The feeling she had now was completely different from when she first started in this role. Everything was now within her reach. This company, those who had once looked down on her, all were now under her control. But she didn't just want that. She wanted change. She wanted to create an environment where no one was judged by the color of their skin or their background. Emily looked at the computer screen where financial reports lit up the display. She was ready for the next step. While big partners may be pulling back major contracts on hold, Emily knew this was her opportunity to create a more sustainable future for the company. Not with contracts worth millions of dollars, not with investments from the big players. For Emily, what mattered most was trust, integrity, and fairness. Her hand hovered over the phone, a message from the CFO appearing. "Emily, we need to decide on the next move. Overseas partners are worried about the situation. We can retain some contracts." If Emily didn't rush to respond, but a small smile spread across her face. She knew this wasn't the time to chase after money or relationships. She wouldn't allow herself to be caught up in those things again. Instead, she wanted to build a stronger foundation, one where true value came not from wealth, but from people, from fairness and respect. She quickly picked up the phone and called her executives. "Thank you for waiting. Tomorrow morning we'll have a meeting. We will restructure the company, change the way we operate, and start over from the most solid foundation, respect for every individual, and transparency in our work." When she hung up the phone, the leaders of the company would understand that Emily wasn't just trying to salvage the current situation. She wanted to create a revolution within the very company she had founded. Everything would change from the core values. No more grandstanding, no more strategies based on so-called connections, but respect between people. The next day the meeting was held. The executives and department heads sat around the table, their faces full of worry. They didn't know what Emily was thinking, but they could feel the determination in her gaze. Emily entered the meeting room, no trace of worry, only unwavering confidence. "Thank you for joining the meeting today." Emily began, her voice calm but full of authority. "I want to announce that we will change the way the company operates. We will no longer continue down the path that has led to failure in recent days. What we need is real change, starting from the basic principles." A few of the executives exchanged glances, slightly stunned, but unable to deny the strength in Emily's words. She continued, "We will not let those in power place themselves above everyone else. We will build a company based on respect, fairness, and protecting the rights of all employees. I don't just want to build an empire, I want to build an environment where everyone can grow fairly." The executives said nothing, but their eyes had changed. They knew that Emily was not just a leader with power, but someone with vision and determination. They would have to change with her. The meeting ended with a clear consensus. Emily had shown them that the company needed more than just numbers or big contracts. It needed real values, values she would protect at all costs. In the days that followed, Hale Technologies began to change. New policies were implemented, and values of respect and fairness were reinforced. Despite many difficulties, Emily no longer felt anxious. She knew she had made the right choice. Meanwhile, Richard, somewhere in the company, could feel the changes he couldn't stop. He still remembered Emily's calm gaze, a look that carried not only challenge, but also awakening. She had made him realize that in this life, true power didn't lie in wealth or power, but in respect and fairness. And in this battle, Emily had won. The next morning, as the first light of the new day shone through the windows of Hale Technologies, the atmosphere in the company had completely changed. Employees walked into the office with a different look in their eyes. They could feel the difference in every corner of the company. Gone were the looks of frustration or fear, replaced by a new sense of anticipation, a hope for a fairer future. Emily had done what no one had expected, not just changing the company structure, but changing the entire culture here. From the moment she walked into the company this morning, every employee under her leadership could feel the steadiness and determination in every step she took. She didn't need to say much because everything was already clear. She had shown everyone that leading a company required not only talent, but also integrity. In the days that followed, Emily continued to make the bold decisions she had planned. Internal policies were changed, new rules were set, and most importantly, the work environment was significantly improved. Employees no longer worked just for money. They worked because they believed in the values Emily had established: fairness, respect, and opportunity for all. First, Emily ordered a restructuring of the Human Resources Department. She wanted to ensure that no one in the company would face discrimination or unfair treatment for any reason. Policies regarding salaries and promotions were also adjusted to ensure every employee had the opportunity to develop fairly, without being hindered by race, gender, or background. Then she conducted an internal survey to gather feedback from employees about the work environment, and the results didn't surprise her. More than 70% of employees felt they hadn't been treated fairly before. This only strengthened her resolve. She began organizing training sessions on respect and equality, bringing in outside experts to teach the entire company how to build a discrimination-free work environment where every individual could unleash their full potential without fear of bias or unfair treatment. With these changes, Emily not only improved the work environment, but also built a company culture that anyone could be proud to be a part of. She proved that a strong company isn't just based on profit numbers, but on a solid foundation of human values, where everyone is treated with respect and fairness. Meanwhile, Richard Anderson was still struggling with the collapse of the empire he had built. Every meeting, every report served as a painful reminder of the mistakes he had made. The company was facing a serious crisis in both reputation and finances. Major contracts were cancelled. Key partners were refusing to work with him. But the most painful truth Richard couldn't avoid was that Emily had won, and he who had once thought he was the only one with power was now nothing more than a defeated man in the very war he had started. He couldn't deny that everything had changed the moment he had disrespected Emily at the gala. Every word, every action he had taken then had been remembered, and now the consequences were arriving. Richard stood in front of the mirror, staring at himself. He realized that true power isn't about control, but about respect and kindness toward others. Everything he had once believed to be important was now nothing but trivial things he could no longer hold on to. In another meeting with the CFO, Richard sat in silence. He no longer had the confidence he once had, no longer the leader with sharp strategies and wise decisions. He was now the one backed into a corner, unable to do anything but watch his company fall deeper into trouble. Once again he tried calling Emily, hoping to persuade her to change her mind. But this time the call went unanswered. She didn't need to say anything more. Emily had done everything necessary to put the company back in its rightful place, and she didn't have to use her power to crush Richard. She simply held her ground and let the truth speak for itself. Everything was clear now. Justice doesn't need to shout. It only takes one person to stand firm and act on the right values. Emily had proven that. After her changes, Hale Technologies didn't just recover, it grew stronger than ever. New partners began reaching out not just for profit, but for the credibility and respect Emily had built. And while Richard, who once stood at the top, was now a shadow of himself, Emily continued to rise, becoming a symbol of true power, the power that comes from respect and kindness. The following morning, as the first light of the new day streamed through the windows of Hale Technologies, the atmosphere in the company had completely changed. Everything was distinctly different, from the way employees communicated to how the executives made decisions. No longer were there looks of indifference, no more awkward silences, no longer any division between departments. The company was now full of new life thanks to Emily's leadership, a woman who had proven that true power doesn't lie in money or authority, but in ethics, compassion, and resilience. As Emily entered the office that morning, the light from the window illuminated her desk, filling the space with brightness. She sat down, her hand gliding over the wooden desk, smiling as she looked at the positive financial reports and the noticeable changes in the company's environment. Everything was within her reach. The decisions she had made not only changed the way the company operated, but also laid a solid foundation for the future. Today, Emily didn't have any urgent meetings or financial reports to deal with, but she knew that her work was never truly finished. The change she had brought about wasn't an end, but the beginning of a long journey. That journey would never be easy, but she would always move forward with determination. A decisive meeting. When the executives and department heads entered the meeting room, the atmosphere remained as serious and decisive as ever. But there was something different in the way everyone looked at one another. There was no longer any anxiety or hesitation, but a sense of collaboration, a spirit of unity. The executives all understood that now Emily's company was not just a powerful financial empire, but a place that protected human values. The meeting began with Emily standing up, looking each person in the eye. She didn't need to start with flowery words. She only needed one simple, strong sentence. We've reached a new stage, and I want each of us to always remember that every decision we make must reflect the values we are building. There is no compromise when it comes to fairness and respect. The executives sat in silence, no one speaking, but they understood what she was conveying. They no longer had to worry about loss or failure, but about continuing to build and strengthen what they had already achieved. Emily didn't just want them to follow rules. She wanted them to become true leaders, ones who could bring change not only within the company, but also in society. The change never stops. After the meeting, Emily continued working with various departments in the company. She went to Human Resources, where she had requested changes to the promotion and recruitment policies. She wanted to ensure that every employee in the company had an equal opportunity, free from any discrimination, whether based on gender, race, or background. Emily understood that when everyone has an equal chance, the company would become a place of sustainable and long-term growth. She also worked closely with the marketing department to build the company's image not only as a name in the industry, but as a symbol of innovation and fairness. Promotional campaigns focused not only on products, but also on the company's mission to protect the rights of everyone and create a work environment where all are treated with respect. Restoring reputation. While these changes began to yield positive results, it was undeniable that restoring the company's reputation was a long process. Former partners had turned away, major contracts had been cancelled, and old relationships were no longer what they once were. However, Emily was undeterred. She knew rebuilding wasn't easy, but she also understood that the most important thing was to have faith in her own values. "We'll rebuild our partners' trust step by step," she told the company's external relations director. "We don't need to rush. Everything will come from the transparency and fairness we show." She began rebuilding relationships with former partners, not just by inviting them to workshops, but by creating new collaboration opportunities based on the values the company pursued. Gradually, they began to realize that the decisions Emily had made not only brought financial benefits, but also created positive change in the industry. Guiding the company back on track. In the months that followed, the company not only held its ground, but grew stronger. Contracts began to return, but this time they came not because the company could offer the highest prices, but because they had proven their worth in values. Partners from large corporations to smaller companies realized that Hale Technologies wasn't just a company that knew how to make money, but also a company with heart won that knew how to uphold its core values. Emily received praise from external organizations. She was not only a talented CEO, but also a woman who pioneered changing the way big companies operated, helping them reevaluate the value of respect and fairness in every decision. Emily's story. That day, as Emily stood on the rooftop of the company building, looking out at the city, she felt the change within herself. She had once faced challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. But now she knew that she wasn't just a winner. She was someone who had changed an entire system. True power isn't something you can measure with money or fame, Emily thought to herself. It's the ability to maintain dignity and integrity in any circumstance. From the highest point, she looked down at the city below, the lights shining brightly, and realized that she had created a change not just within the company, but in the lives she had touched. This was the result of persistence of belief in her own values and in what was right. And Emily knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey. She would continue to change, not just for the company, but for society. That was the final victory, the victory of justice, respect, and a person who would never abandon their ideals. Emily Carter's story is not just one of change in the corporate world, but a profound lesson about power, fairness, and the importance of maintaining dignity in any circumstance. She is a woman who could easily have been overlooked by society, but thanks to her dignity and resilience, she not only stood up against discrimination, but also helped build a solid foundation for her company's future. The lesson here isn't just for those in business, but for all of us who face challenges in life. Truly, power doesn't come from being able to control others or using money as a tool of oppression, but from the ability to maintain integrity and respect for others. Every decision, big or small, must be made based on one core value: fairness and respect. This is the foundation of long-lasting and sustainable success. In today's world, where money and power are often seen as the only measures of success, Emily Carter's story is a clear testament that respect and integrity are more important than any asset. True leaders are not those who only know how to make money and achieve goals blindly, but those who protect dignity and justice in every decision they make. Emily has proven that no matter how many challenges or criticisms you face, if you stand firm in your values, you not only win, but you can change the system itself. She didn't need to use physical force or impose her power to gain respect. She simply stood firm with what she believed in and let the truth speak for itself. And as a result, she didn't just succeed in changing her company. She created a new model for leadership in the 21st century. That is the lesson we should take from Emily's story. Real power is not something that can be bought, but something that must be built from within, from integrity, from the courage to stand up for what is right, even when those around you may not understand it immediately. Emily has shown us that a person can change an entire industry, not by defeating their opponents, but by defeating themselves. The second lesson this story brings is the importance of ethics in leadership. In recent years, we have witnessed countless scandals in the business world, where decisions were made not for the benefit of workers or the community, but solely for personal gain and the consolidation of power. Stories like these not only harm public trust, but also cause companies, no matter how strong they are, to face inevitable collapse. However, Emily's story took a different direction. She didn't seek to exploit her power to take what belonged to others, but instead she used that power to protect the values she believed in. She created a work environment free of discrimination, where every employee had an equal opportunity to grow. More importantly, she proved that leadership isn't about issuing commands and controlling others, but standing on the side of truth and fairness, even if that means facing significant challenges. One of the most notable things in Emily's story is the change. While Hale Technologies had once been dominated by discrimination and the absolute power of the top leaders, Emily decided to change everything. She didn't just change how the company operated, but she changed the values the company pursued. And the important thing is, she did this not just to protect her own company, but to create a model that other companies could learn from. We live in a rapidly changing world where old values no longer fit. The standards for leadership power and respect need to change as well. Emily's story is a reminder that change is possible, and sometimes it is that very change that leads us to a brighter future. She has proven that with determination and persistence, everything can change. Emily's story also shows us something important about power and justice. They cannot be separated. Power without justice is simply manipulation. Justice without power is just theory. This story shows us that in every decision we make, fairness must always accompany power. Only when we maintain fairness can our decisions bring lasting and sustainable results. Emily is not only a talented leader, but also someone with foresight. She has shown how to combine power and justice to build a company that is not only strong financially, but also strong in human values. And that is something anyone in leadership should learn from. If you feel inspired by this story and believe that real power lies in respect and justice, like this video to spread this powerful message to the community. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to never miss inspiring stories and valuable lessons about leadership, justice, and change. Leave a comment with the word justice below this video to share your thoughts on this story and the values you want to see in the business world. Remember, big changes start with small actions, and you can be the one to create that change.